right. Hello, everyone. I hope you all had a very good break. I don't know about all of you, but I'm feeling a little bit out of sorts coming back today. I forgot my ID card, so I couldn't swipe in. And I've just realized that I don't have my version of the slides with my notes on them, so we're just going to wing it today, which is, I suppose, appropriate because we're talking about memory. But yeah, before we get into that, I had a couple other things I wanted to mention. Please remember that you have your written assignment due tonight through Moodle. So make sure that you've remembered to submit that. And if you haven't yet, you have until, I believe it's open until midnight tonight. So make sure you do that. I have the midterms graded now. I made an error on my Scantron key, and when I ran it through the first couple of people, it was marking basically at random because I was off by a number. So I had to go back and redo those, and the system was inaccessible for me over reading week. I couldn't come in and regrade them, so I had to do it this morning. So I'll be putting it together and uploading it tonight, so you should see those grades today. It was just one of those things where one thing after another was not working for me. But hopefully we're back on track now. But I think that was everything I wanted to say outside of class topics. So today we are going to get back into talking about memory. And actually we can go much further ahead than this. I forgot that I have all the slides here. So we can go all the way to, we were talking about extending our capacity for memory. So we can start all the way down here. All right. So this is going to be a kind of a confusing looking diagram on the surface, but it's actually a really useful diagram that kind of shows us a lot of the stuff we've been talking about with memory already, and a lot of the stuff that we will be talking about as we continue on in the topic. So for this diagram, we've been talking mostly about sensory memory, and then we had moved into our immediate memory, which was what we were using to refer to our short-term / working memory. And I really like that term because it allows us to talk about both without having to say short-term working memory. So immediate memory is a useful one there. So if we start at the beginning, we have some kind of sensory input. That's where our sensory registers are either iconic or echoic stores are picking up information. And then we have access to that information for a very short period of time before we decide what we're going to do with it. And so we can forget at basically any stage of this for memory. So we could decide that something isn't important, it is irrelevant, we drop it out of our consciousness right off the bat if we don't sort of pay attention to it. So sensory memory we can forget right away. Then we have stuff that we pay attention to would enter into our immediate memory. We can also pull from our long-term memory to do stuff in our immediate memory. So maybe you're remembering directions somewhere or doing something you've done before. You can pull or retrieve information from that long-term memory. And we'll talk about that process a little bit later in the chapter. But when we have our immediate memory, we can either immediately do something with it. We can have some kind of output. We can recall our grocery list. We can sort of repeat a phone number or whatever it is that we're doing. So that can be immediate output. We can rehearse, where we maintain that in our immediate memory. So you could repeat your grocery list to yourself over and over again, or we could forget it. As we talked about with our immediate memory, after about 20 seconds or so, if we're not actively rehearsing it, we're going to lose that information. So we can forget at that stage as well. And then when we start talking about long-term memory, we're going to talk about encoding stuff that we had in our immediate memory, things that we were doing or thinking about, things that had entered into our consciousness that can then be transferred over for longer-term storage in the process of encoding. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that just sort of orients us on this model. And this model, you can see it called a bunch of different things. I've seen it called the 3-component model. Sometimes you'll see it named after the scientists who named it or who proposed it. I don't have their names here because I lost my notes, but the modal memory model is fine because we're looking at sort of 3 distinctive categories. And there's lots of different variations on this. Sometimes you'll see, again, that immediate memory replaced with short-term memory or working memory, depending on what kind of research you're looking at or who's proposing something. But this is a pretty good start. Okay, so far, as I've said, we've been talking about our immediate memory as short-term memory, effectively, where short-term memory is just saying that we are holding information temporarily and just holding it, not necessarily doing anything with it. And so we can hold that information visually. We can have images in our mind. Maybe you just saw something flash on the screen. Maybe somebody walked by and you saw something. We can have phonological storage, so maybe you just heard something. We can have semantics, so storage of the meaning of something. Or we can have storage of actions. So if you watch somebody do an action, you can store movement in your memory. So if you're watching someone, say, pitch a baseball, and you want to remember that action so you can repeat it to yourself so you can try it again, maybe someone's teaching you how to pitch. That would be an action that you can hold in your memory. But, as I said, it's not just the sort of holding that we do in our immediate memory. We also do work with what we have in our immediate memory. And that's where the working memory side of things comes in. And so the distinction here is that you're not just holding something in that memory. Now we're doing something with it. So you're actually working with the information. And so it's still going to be a limited capacity system, so you're still going to store information for a short duration, but now we're working with or manipulating that information. So this would be something like doing mental math. If somebody asks you to add a couple of numbers together, you have to manipulate that information. You have to have some kind of concept of what those numbers are and how you move them together. You'd have to pull on your long-term memory of how addition works, and then sort of do the work while holding all of that mentally. And it's still going to have about the same limitations as we were talking about for just normal short-term memory, things like about a 20-second duration and only being able to hold sort of 7 plus or minus 2 digits, depending again on who you ask. So you're going to lose that information very quickly if you're not actively working with it. But when we talk about working memory, we actually can go into even more detail because it's not just statically holding either a vision or a sort of a visual thing, an auditory thing, an action, or a meaning. Now we're doing stuff with it and sometimes even moving things together. So it's going to be a lot more complex. And there are a bunch of different theories of how working memory actually works, but one that seems to do a pretty good job of explaining it involves 4 different sort of sections of working memory. And these aren't necessarily sort of hard areas of the brain that are doing anything. This is, again, sort of a theoretical division of labor because our understanding of memory is still a little bit fuzzy. But here we care mostly about our central executive. So this is basically the part of the brain that's responsible for controlling everything else. It decides what we attend to, it decides what information we need, and which other parts of the brain need to get that information. So the central executive basically makes all the decisions and shuttles information about and takes control of everything. And the 3 sections that it's working with are going to be our phonological loop, which would be our inner voice, sort of a, say someone gives you instructions to do a particular task. That would be your remembering of the order of what they told you to do. That's also going to relate to our episodic buffer. So this is going to be a temporary storage, but specifically looking at, like when we talk about episodes, sort of a time component. So this is when things are, say you get directions. So not only do you have to remember what words you were told, you have to remember what order you were told them in. So you turn right and then left. So you keep that order of the events in your mind. So the episodic buffer holds on to order of events. And then we also have our visuospatial sketch pad, and that's our sort of inner eye. That's how we visualize things that we've been told, or things that we've seen. Again, we can use our directions example, and okay, so maybe you were told, turn left at this place, turn right at this place. The visuospatial sketch pad would give you sort of a mental representation of the actions you're going to be doing, where you're going to have to turn, and what you're watching for. And our central executive is going to work with all of these to make sure that everything works together. You'll find that all of those arrows on there are double-ended because this information is going to move around. We're going to have lots of intercommunication between these different parts of the brain. And following directions is one of the best ways to think about activating all of these, because we have somebody giving you sort of verbal instructions, we have a particular order that you need to hold on to, and we need some kind of internal visualization of what's going on. And all of it is controlled by our central executive. All right. Okay, so that was wrapping up our immediate memory conversation. So we're coming back to our model here just to show what we have talked about. So that's immediate memory. Now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about our long-term memory, and specifically looking at how we start moving information into our long-term memory. So long-term memory would be considered our sort of library, our storage of memories, stuff that we've been holding on to, stuff that we have in our capacity, things that we can draw on, things that we can pull into our awareness. So it's going to be a fairly durable storage system. So if you can remember things from when you were a child, you can remember things from last week. So we have a pretty good ability to remember things. And it's not just things that have happened to us. We don't just remember events in our own lives. We also have sort of this recollection of factual information. You might be able to recall what the capital of Canada is because in geography class they made you remember it. And so there's a lot of debate about how large of a storage capacity we have. Some texts talk about about the equivalent of watching like 500 hours of high definition video. Others are a lot less keen on putting a cap on it. So somewhere between very, very large and theoretically unlimited is where we put our capacity for storage of information. And there isn't really a theoretical sort of end to what we can remember. So it should be able to endure for a lifetime, though we will talk about some disorders that end up sort of messing with that a little bit. And so here we can actually start looking at why our regular rehearsal versus elaborative rehearsal that we mentioned very, very briefly early on actually makes a difference. So we had talked about elaborative rehearsal where you're adding extra information to something that you're rehearsing. And we kind of skimmed over why it was so helpful. So we were using our grocery list. And so I was talking about getting eggs and milk and bread. And so if you're just doing normal rehearsal, you're just referring back to it. So eggs, milk, bread, don't forget. But if we're doing elaborative rehearsal, you're going to start pulling from things that you already know, start making connections and involving other parts of your brain. So I need eggs and milk because I'm going to make a cake. And I bought a mix from the store, but I forgot to get eggs and milk to go with it. So I need those. And then bread because I want toast in the morning. So by making those connections with what I need it for, what I'm going to do with it, we're elaborating on those things. And by activating other parts of our brain, we make it a little bit easier to maintain those things in our memory. And the way that this is working is it's actually kind of in that gray area between our immediate memory and our long-term memory. So we're doing a little bit of dipping into our long-term memory. We're sort of going into stuff that we already know. And we're saying, okay, well, let's make some associations. So we're going to do almost like a little bit of encoding because we're associating it with stuff that we've already stored away. So we're making it easier to recall or retrieve later. So this can help us be less likely to forget on our walk over. Say maybe we get distracted. Somebody walks by with a cute dog and you forget to repeat your list, but because you've made associations, it's a little bit easier to piece it back together. For some other ways that we can enrich our encoding, that storage to our long-term memory, there are lots of other ways that we can make that a stronger association. And you're going to find that a lot of what we're talking about with memory focuses in on the idea that the more parts of the brain that you recruit, the more extra associations that you can make, the better you're going to be able to recall that thing later. So the process of elaboration ties in with our elaborative rehearsal. You're linking some kind of stimulus to other information that you already know at the time of encoding. So imagine that you're studying for a test, and instead of trying to remember just a grocery list, maybe you're trying to remember all of the different stages of memory. Okay, so we've talked about how it's like a computer. So we have our short-term memory is the stuff that we're actively working on the screen, things that when we shut everything down, they're going to go away, unless we save it to our longer-term memory. So we can start making some connections there. We're elaborating and thinking of examples that make it a little bit easier to visualize what's going on. And that kind of leads us to our next one, which is visual imagery. So if you add or create visual images that help you represent the things that you're trying to remember, we're recruiting another part of the brain, another system. And again, it's going to make it a little bit easier to remember. So if you're studying, you could think of, okay, what does this remind me of? What image does this conjure? Maybe you think of the slide or a graph that was shown to illustrate a particular point. And it might be easier for you to remember a graph along with a relationship as opposed to just the relationship. So adding extra stuff to it. And of course, visual imagery is a lot easier when you're working on sort of concrete objects. So if we're thinking about a grocery list, it's a lot easier to visualize a grocery list than it is to visualize, say, the 3 stages of memory. Though that's why we try with some of our diagrams, because visual aids can be helpful. And this idea of dual coding is talking about we're not just remembering the words, we're not just remembering the meanings, we're now also remembering something else. So what does it look like? What does it remind us of? So more systems recruited, better remembering. And then our last way to enrich encoding is called self-referent encoding. And this is when you make it meaningful to yourself. So if you're thinking about, again, studying for a particular topic, if you think about an example in your life that helps illustrate a particular topic, that makes it a lot more relevant to you and it makes it more meaningful to you. So again, more areas of the brain recruited and you have a better recall later on. We can also look at levels of processing. So when we're trying to remember information, there are a bunch of different ways that we can sort of consider that information. And along with our idea of more is going to be better, the more processing you put in while you're trying to learn something, the better that's going to stick with you. So this diagram here is just showing us shallow, intermediate, and deep processing. So very little processing down to quite a lot of processing. So with shallow processing, that's when we're just doing something like, say, structural encoding. So if you look at the physical structure of a stimulus, so we ask you about a word, is it written in all capitals or all small letters? That's not really doing a whole lot about the meaning of the word. So that would be a very shallow level of processing. So maybe you're trying to remember a bunch of definitions for a class. And instead of focusing in on anything associated with the word itself, you focus on the shape of the letters. Does it have the letter C in it? Something like that. Intermediate processing is somewhere kind of in the middle, a little bit more processing than our shallow processing. And this is something like phonemic encoding, which would emphasize what a word sounds like. Okay, so if you're learning a definition, they might ask you, does it sound or does it rhyme with weight? Or does it rhyme with car? So you're associating it with other things. That's a little bit more helpful. And then deep processing, this is when we're really starting to make connections with things. So this would be like semantic encoding, and semantic just means meaning. So you emphasize the meaning of what you're saying. So if you were asked, does this word fit into this sentence? That's asking you to understand that word's meaning and how it relates to something else. So again, deeper encoding. And so for these examples, you might have figured out that this is common to psychological studies, where they'll basically give you a list of words and ask you a bunch of questions about those words, and then see how well you perform on recalling each of those words, dependent upon what method they use to get you to sort of think about them. And so if we look at the graph on this slide here, we see that the deeper the encoding, the more encoding that we have, the more words we're going to recall, so the better our performance. And it's almost always going to be a really, really nice positive relationship here where, again, more means better recall. And they can do this with a bunch of different things. So it's almost always words. They might look at numbers or colors or whatever, but words are the easiest. All right. So that's pretty good getting us started on the encoding process. But I do also want to talk just a little bit about what kinds of information we encode, because we actually have different categories of information, and these different categories of information are actually stored a little bit differently, which is very, very cool. So first we're going to talk about what we can call declarative memory. So declarative memory is stuff that you can declare or talk about. So this would be things like episodic memory and semantic memory. So we could call this also explicit because we can talk about it. It's something we can say, I remember this, or I know that. And so for our two types here, we have episodic memory, which we've already talked a little bit about episodic as it pertained to our working memory. So episodic is just episodes or events, specifically within our own lives. So these are memories whose context or contents pertain to specific events or episodes in your own life. So maybe you remember going on a trip when you were younger. That is something that happened to you, so that is episodic memory. Semantic memory, on the other hand, are memories whose contents relate to specific facts and pieces of meaningful information that are not based on personal experience. So these are things like the capital of Canada, or the fact that water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Anything that you know, probably that you learned in school, even if you learned it through experience, as long as it's sort of a fact that is irrelevant of your personal experience or your personal life, it would fall under semantic memory. So you might know that Ottawa is the capital of Canada, but you might not know when you first learned that because it's just a fact. If you remember specifically sitting in a geography class and a specific teacher, and the first time they told you that that was the capital of Canada, that would be an episodic memory because you're remembering a particular moment in time that you experienced. But the knowledge itself, that knowing that the capital is Ottawa, that's semantic memory. And so those are our two types of declarative memory, and so you can kind of see if we can talk about it. I remember this thing, or I know this fact. You can talk about those. That's why it's an explicit type of memory. But procedural memory is our implicit memory. So this is stuff that you can't necessarily declare because this is stuff that you do. So procedural memories are memories whose contents pertain to how something is done. So maybe you know how to throw a baseball. Maybe you know how to swing a golf club. Maybe you know how to walk upstairs. That's all procedural memory. And you can't necessarily describe the process, but you can show someone the process, which is why we call it implicit. It's something that's sort of internal. You can do it, but you can't necessarily say it easily. So it's a lot easier to show than it is to talk about. And interestingly, we've seen that these sort of declarative memories, the things that we can talk about, and our procedural memories are typically stored in slightly different places. So we're going to look at a couple of case studies a little bit later on in this chapter where we see how they're separated. But we've already talked about different parts of the brain that have different roles. And so maybe you remember that our cerebellum, that part at the sort of base of our brain, is really good with movements and coordinating movement. So there's some evidence that our procedural memory at least involves that part of the brain. And we do see sometimes even people who have, say, amnesia, they might forget their declarative memory, but they can still perform actions when given the opportunity. So they may forget who they are, but they might still be able to ride a bike. And so that's giving us evidence that those two systems are separate, which is very, very cool. And of course, these questions of, are these things actually distinctive? Where are they stored? This is pretty critical to all sorts of scientists. We want to know what's going on, where it's happening, and what the differences are. And so there's a lot of debate whether short and long-term memory are the same or different systems. The two major theories are kind of like what we've been looking at so far, where we have our sensory memory, and then our immediate memory, and then we have our long-term memory, and it's sort of like a continuous passage through. But some people actually say that our immediate memory is just a subset of our working memory, of our long-term memory, where it's just sort of the part that's active, but it's all in one place. It's all a continuous system. There's not necessarily a separation. And there's evidence for each of them. I find it a little bit easier to visualize the sort of three separate systems and just know that they intercommunicate. But there are some people that argue that they are the same. And so, of course, if we wanted to figure out, okay, are they actually separate? What is this evidence of them being similar or different? This is going to come from case studies. And so we have lots and lots of different individuals who've had usually damage to particular parts of the brain, where we can study what happens when certain areas are damaged and how it affects their ability to either form or recall memories. And we can look at, okay, is there a situation where somebody can lose their long-term memory but still have their short-term memory? And that one kind of makes sense. You've probably seen enough movies with amnesia that even people who have no access to their long-term memories, they can still function in everyday life. They can still do mental math. They can still remember that they're doing something. They might just not be able to think of things that came before. So that one's pretty easy to see, but there are also special cases where we can look at individuals who, say, have very diminished short-term memory, but functional long-term memory. And that's a lot harder to visualize, but there are individuals who've had damage to parts of the brain who basically lose their digit span. I'll talk more in depth about these in a little bit, but there's one individual who has, instead of a digit span of like 7, we had that 7 plus or minus 2 where you can hold on to a whole bunch of information. This individual, their digit span is 1 or 2. So by the time that they start saying a number, they forget what comes next. So it's really interesting to see. And then a couple of terms that will be helpful when we start talking about these case studies are going to be anterograde amnesia and retrograde amnesia. So these are basically issues with our long-term memory. So anterograde amnesia is loss of the ability to assimilate and retain new knowledge. So if you've ever watched the movie Memento, you follow a main character who as soon as something is out of his short-term memory, as soon as it's out of his working memory, he no longer has access to that information. So he can't make new memories. So he has to write everything down, or else he will immediately forget it. So this is, you can have perfectly functional short-term or immediate memory, but you can't form new memories. Or you can have a retrograde amnesia, which is when you lose memory for events that happened in the past. So you can form new long-term memories, but anything before the development of amnesia would be lost. And again, some movie examples. The Bourne Identity is a good one of this, where he suffers trauma and can't recall his past. And so in some of these cases, you can have sort of temporary amnesia. Usually there's a source of trauma, and then your brain will recover and allow you to sort of go back to normal. Sometimes the damage is permanent, and there is no way to retrieve those memories. And I thought this was going to take longer because I wanted to do a full class just talking about our case studies. So I guess we're going to have a short lecture today. I guess that's what happens when I lose my notes. But we'll leave it there for today. And then tomorrow's class, I actually want to do Wednesday, we're going to do a bunch of videos about individuals who have lost parts of their memory. So we're going to watch a couple of those and then talk about those case studies and what they show us and inform us about this whole process of making memories and things like that. So I will see you guys on Wednesday. Don't forget about your written assignment. I'll see you then.